Welcome to Designing Cities for All, another episode, and it's part of a 2-year-long activity and research program
where we take a deep dive into designing products, spaces, and systems for all. Just because you feel safe or you feel welcome or you feel included doesn't mean that everyone else around you feels the same way.
We don't stand alone. We're not individuals that somehow a planet or an island, you know?
And I think that's the beautiful thing of a diverse society, that everyone can add something from out of their own experience.
Things won't change just if we just let things happen.
I think if you can build relationships and use design as a tool to build those relationships, the better off we're all going to be.
Everything around us was once designed and can therefore be redesigned.
Belonging is a very, very important concept.
You can try to take someone's place for a while, but you don't have the lived experience.
Let's begin by acknowledging similarity and affinity.
Be a person, not your role.
I think inclusion is not a choice.
Inclusion happens by design or not at all.
In order to create truly inclusive public spaces that are accessible to everyone, we have to underline what everyone actually is.
Real inclusion, it's got nothing to do with the norm, but it's like something that we create from all different perspectives.
You know, so even when we bring everybody at the table, does everybody's voice count the same?
Because it's a big question of who tells these stories.
You know, the more I explore about other cultures, other religions, is the more ingredients I have to make the architecture and to answer the questions I get from society.
Not fitting in was a blessing, or I would have turned out just like you.
I love that last quote. Welcome, everyone, to our Designing Cities for All book club evening. What you just saw in the video is a wrap-up of the first year of Designing Cities for All. Indeed, a 2-year research and activity program that takes a deep dive into designing products and places and systems for all. And next to the designers and scientists and experts and educational institutions and other partners, there are 6 fellows that were invited to curate part of the program. And sitting next to me are our current fellows, the Chrononauten, the Chrononauts, and their fellowship, these 2 futurists, Edwin Gardner and Christian Fruneau, rethink the shape of trust and democracy in the digital age. And together with you, and you watching as well, we've explored how we can build new architectures of trust in a changing world in a new era. And today is a special book club edition, and the book that the Chrononauts chose to read for their fellowship book club, I think most of you have it in your hands already, is this one, Internet for the People by Ben Tarnoff. And we're really excited to have Ben with us this evening. I'll introduce him in a sec. And the book is about how and why the internet was privatized and how we might change that structure of the internet to become more for all, for the people, by the people. And today we'll speak about the consequences, or like some of the important aspects and factors in the book and beyond the book, with the 3 of you, Ed, Christian, and Ben. And we also very much welcome you to just join the conversation and ask any question that you might have. That also goes for people watching online. And if you're watching online, you can use a Mentimeter for that. So you go to menti.com and you use the code 45786736. And I'll have my tablet here, and I'll see when you ask questions, and we can incorporate them. And I really welcome you to ask questions at any point in the conversation. My name is Lynn Zebeda. I've been with these gentlemen for the last couple of weeks, exploring these architectures of trust, and I'm really excited actually to hear what Ben has to add. But before we go to you, Ben, or maybe you want to already wave to us for a sec, so we can see you. He's really here. Hi, Ben.
Not Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Of course, you're so welcome. I'll come back to you in a sec. I first wanted to ask Edwin and Christian, just super briefly, like, why did you choose this book?
Well, I think Ben, with his book, is, I think, very much on the same page as us. So I think one part of the analysis I think both of us share is that just looking at the internet or digital services and platforms as a market is not enough. So market solutions or solutions from, let's say, government towards, let's say, the digital sphere as a market are, let's say, regulation. They have to behave better, and we'll make rules for that. Or breaking up monopolies. So they have too much power, consolidated, so there's not enough competition. So this is the toolbox in the US as well as here in Europe for regulating mostly. And we think that's enough because it's also a public sphere. It's where culture is produced. It's much more than just a market. So we also need other kinds of solutions.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I think you said it well.
Yeah. So
Well, maybe I can ask you, which topics would you like to dive deeper into together with Ben this evening and with the audience?
I think one of the things I'm interested in, and hopefully Ben as well, is that we feel that if you want to engage something as a market, there's like this whole toolkit for it, right? There's this whole language that is apparent, policymakers use it, people in the market themselves use it. But if you want to approach something as a public good or as a commons or as a public sphere, public domain, or then we sort of lack the language, we sort of lack the conceptual framework, or we've forgotten the conceptual framework to analyze it or to make policy from that. And I'm also very curious to explore that with Ben. I don't know if he recognizes this or, but
let's ask him in
that's something. Yeah. And I'm also curious to listen to hear, for example, what he hopes that a healthy internet will produce for the people.
What a healthy internet would produce for the people.
Yeah. So what value will it create for the communities it serves?
Right. Yeah, interesting. Definitely. Who here has actually read the book? Or maybe just started reading it? Okay, great. I mean, some of you just started reading it. So 5 minutes ago. No, perfect. It's very okay. This conversation is accessible to all, but really nice that you read the book already, and I recommend it as well. So, again, if you have a question, please come with it. And for now, I would love to ask Ben a couple of questions myself. Hi, Ben, again. You're behind me as well, and I can see you in front of me as well. Hi. So Ben Tarnoff is a tech worker, a writer, a co-founder of Logic magazine. And maybe first of all, on that introduction, Ben, what you describe yourself as a tech worker. It sounds maybe like a health worker, but for tech, or what does it mean to you, tech worker?
That's a good question. And I should start again by thanking all of you for having me here, and for reading the book. You know, as we all know, writing is a very lonely thing. You sit in your room alone, and then the book goes out into the world, and you're not sure if anyone will ever read it. So it's always very gratifying to know that there are people on the other end, so to speak. So tech worker, I suppose, has a descriptive element and a more political element. The descriptive element, which is how it's used increasingly in a kind of neutral way, at least in the United States, is just someone who works in tech. It's a slightly less pretentious way than saying something like technologist, and it reflects the fact that there are many roles within the tech industry, as this room of people who think about design know, right? Product designer, product manager, software engineer, and so on. The political piece, and I promise to be brief, you probably don't want a whole disquisition on this subject.
I'm curious, though.
the political piece of it, and this is, I think, another element that has driven its wider adoption in recent years, is the attempt to get particularly those who inhabit professional roles like myself to conceptualize their relationship to their own work and to their workplaces as one of labor, rather than an identity based around a professional identity in terms of professionalism, rather than thinking of one as a entrepreneur or as a creative. So, and to that extent, it has been useful in mobilizing support among that layer of the tech workforce, the kind of white collar office layer, for collective actions in different workplaces.
Interesting.
And
It
kind
also
of
sounds
activated
like
certain solidarities.
yeah, you're more than your role. That's what was said in the introduction video edit as well. Actually, you're more than what you do for work. You are a person
Precisely.
that happens to work in this industry. Yeah, great. And if we look at the book that we all have in our hands here, actually, what was the urgency you felt that kind of was your incentive to write this book?
Well, I suppose there's a personal piece of it, which is that I fell in love with the internet as a 9-year-old child. Used the internet for the first time. I have a quite vivid memory of it in Portland, Oregon, at a science museum. And I'm now 37 years old.
Right, same as me.
So this would have been in 1994, I think I first used it. And, became, let's say, a very heavy user of the internet as a young person. And, at some point, the internet became less utopian, I want to say, which is, I forgive me for the kind of cliched arc here, because I think there is this common pattern whereby, heavy users of the internet invest it with all of this kind of emotional charge, and then over time grow disillusioned with it. And this is arguably happening at a kind of large collective scale through the so-called techlash, people falling out of love with the internet as the internet has developed in certain directions that have posed real dangers to our society. So I kind of wanted to make sense of that for myself, is the kind of love-hate relationship with the internet, loving it for what it was, what it could be, hating it for much of what it is today. Yeah, I hear you, definitely. We're also born in the same year, it sounds like. But for maybe my last question for now is, you're also the co-founder of Logic magazine. I looked it up, and you describe it also as a magazine that focuses on deepening the discourse around technology. And we were wondering if you feel that the publication of this book has actually also helped you reach that goal, and actually, do you feel, or what is the impact that you've seen from the publication of the book so far? It's been interesting. I think the conversations have looked very different in different contexts. One of the important variables is the national context. So I've had an opportunity to speak to European audiences a number of times. And I think that, for me is always very informative, because there are telecom and regulatory contexts in particular that are so different in terms of how something like broadband connectivity is distributed. And I've learned a lot through those conversations. As I mentioned to you before, I have kind of grown tired of my own views on the subject. So I'm increasingly just eager to hear what other people are working on and thinking about. But I think the responses have been interesting. I mean, I would say that there has been more of an opening for these types of conversations than I could have possibly imagined. I think the techlash, as we call it, again, apologies for this kind of unlovely but unavoidable word, has opened space for more discourse. I'm not sure it's opened a lot of space for the type of robust political action that we need to build a better internet. But at the very least, there is greater receptivity to certain ideas, certain ways of thinking about the internet that would not have existed 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I'm grateful for that. Yeah.
Well, I think you're also opening up space for discourse right here. Also, I actually kind of love that you say, I've grown tired of my own viewpoints, listening to my own viewpoints. That is creating space for actual conversation. So let's dive into it together, all of us. And maybe I can kick it off by, before like leaving you also to explore what you want to explore. But I mean, we in this series a couple of weeks, like one of our guests is sitting here right in front of me from a previous episode is, we focused on increasing distrust. Like people don't trust in this digital era. They don't trust sources. They don't trust each other online. They don't trust institutions. There's a lot of polarization. And we found that, if we just regulate or try to break up big tech, that's not enough. We need different types of solutions if we want to create that internet that we want. What do you want to say, Chris?
No, you're looking at me, so I was thinking.
No, I was looking at you because you grabbed your mic. Okay. But maybe to ask Ben first, where, in what direction should we look for solutions? As a very open question to kick off your exchange. To create an internet for the people.
That's a big question.
I know, but just the first thing that comes to your mind.
Where to begin? Well, because you said the word trust, maybe I'll use that as an anchor point for my response. I would agree broadly with the diagnosis that at least part of what afflicts the internet, part of why people behave badly on the internet, to put it more simply, is this kind of absence of trust. And I think this is a political problem, and this is a problem that has been discussed at this point for decades. And I would describe it as the hollowing out of civil society. In the United States, there's a famous book that you may be familiar with, which is often used as a kind of shorthand for this problem, called Bowling Alone, which is the kind of decline of bowling leagues in the United States and the rise of people bowling by themselves. But in any case, it's become a kind of metaphor for the broader thinning out of organizations and institutions that used to bring people together in various forms of leisure, or I think more importantly, collective action, unions in particular, political parties, and the various types of social clubs that were formed around these different types of political identities. I think it's very hard for us to imagine building an internet that in which people behave better, in which people treat each other with more respect and dignity, without rebuilding civil society. And again, I kind of hate the term civil society because it's deployed in a lot of very kind of boring NGO contexts, and it's used in this very politically neutral way. When I think of civil society, I think of the bicycle clubs that the SPD used to run in the kind of historic era of Second International social democracy. So I think we want a highly politicized civil society. That's what I would prefer. It's not a bunch of atomized individuals running around, but nonetheless, people need to have these kind of ways of relating to one another, of coming into space with one another, of doing real deliberation with one another, in order for our digital realms to have a degree of decency, in my view.
And do you think that, let's say, if we somehow heal the internet of its quirks and evils, that it can play a constructive role in rebuilding or bringing people together to form new bowling leagues, to form new bicycle groups, to sort of reestablish civil society in a way? Because we see the same thing here in Europe, this hollowing out of tennis clubs, sporting clubs, somehow the platforms that bring people together and that make people produce common goods in a way. They disappear, or the people that do that get older. And we also feel that has something to do with a sort of a disconnect between the public realm, the public domain these days, which is shifted to an electronic space, and a sort of older protocol of organizing, which isn't based in this realm. Yeah, so if we somehow make this electronic realm in such a way, or remake it in such a way that it actually, how said it, empowers these groups, do you think that's possible? That
I think it is in the sense that, but the way I would frame it is that we need to have online services that force us offline. And I'll give you an example from an earlier stage of the internet's development, which I'm sure all of you remember, which is the world before we had the internet in our pocket, the world before the arrival of the smartphone. And that's an internet era that I remember very clearly, where we kind of use the internet in these very discrete kind of fixed settings, and then we go out into the world. And I'm not suggesting that we need to burn all our smartphones, although that would be an interesting article that I would read. But that rather there needs to be I think a saner balance between the online and the offline realms of our lives. I mean, there are great opportunities on the internet to genuinely connect with other people. If I didn't feel that way, I wouldn't write a book about the internet. That's why I fell in love with the internet. I continue to make a lot of friends on the internet. But if those relationships don't at some point develop an offline component, then I think there are a lot of risks. Not least of which the fact that your interactions are being mediated by services that have commercial incentives that often run counter to developing, I don't love the word healthy, but developing valuable, fulfilling, politically useful relationships. So that's part of the issue, as well as I know we'll talk about, is the political economy of the people doing the mediating is often hostile to your interests.
And what do you, because I asked the question before, what do you think a healthy internet should do for the people? What function or what value should it produce for the community? Because maybe some context, we did like we do speculative research. So we do sort of social scientific research, and we translate that towards possible or speculative scenarios. And we thought, let's approach the internet as a public domain. And what should the public domain do? It should, in our very narrow speculative framework, it should produce community. It should order a shared truth, or it should order information and create a shared truth. And it should be the basis of public institutions or public organizing, public decision making. And we sort of looked at how the print world sort of functioned back in the days and how it interacted with civil society. And what do you think? So this is sort of, we thought, well, what should a healthy internet do so we can redesign it? So we came up with these three, let's say, pillars. Do you recognize these pillars, or do you see other functions or values that the internet should produce for the community, for the people?
Could you one more time summarize the pillars, just to
so we had, what should a public domain do?
What
well, it should order information and produce a shared truth.
Yeah.
It should produce community, so a sense of public trust.
Shared truth, community.
And it should produce a sort of basis for public organizing and decision making.
Organizing decision making. Okay. Yeah. So that's the value you see that the internet could bring.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we thought, what if we work from these pillars? What happens then? What kind of design principles come forth from that? And I was wondering how you...
If Ben sees the same type of value categories of value.
Maybe he says, well, I see maybe there are other things the internet should produce, for instance.
It's a good question. I suppose I struggle a little bit with the idea of how to make a healthy internet, because we're not healthy animals, right? Like, I mean, we're not really drawn to things that are good for us, famously. And I think about this more concretely within the context of Twitter, right? Part of the pleasure of Twitter is all of the negative affect of the pile-ons, and, you know, some of the, frankly, the cruelty that people take pleasure in on Twitter, and maybe the kind of narcissism and the affirmation and so on. And one of the things I've noticed as some people migrate to Mastodon is that it doesn't have a lot of the same kind of psychic feedback that activates some of these, you know, in many ways, kind of less savory aspects of our personalities. And I'm not exactly sure what to do with that information, but I think sometimes in our internet reform discourse, and I would include myself in that, we have a tendency to think about the kind of ideal internet as a kind of Habermasian public sphere where we will all kind of deliberate in our in a certain kind of communicative rationality. And it's just not what human beings are. I don't mean to suggest that this means we should kind of give up and just resort to kind of posting insane memes on Twitter for the rest of our lives, because I obviously believe there is a more rational way to organize our online lives. But I guess I present that as a limit, or as something that we kind of need to think through and possibly even enlist, you know, towards our own ends. I mean, to return to this question of where did civil society go, it did not just consist of people kind of rationally deliberating with one another, right? There were all sorts of kind of emotional and indeed irrational and kind of you know, things that we could use psychoanalysis to develop further. Those types of effective investments are as important for forming those organizations as a kind of more rational, deliberative view. I haven't really answered your question.
But I think you add actually a nice fourth pillar in a way with how you respond, because it should also be a creative, adventurous place as well. Besides, let's say, these nice things,
entertaining maybe.
Yeah, so of course maybe it's not very good now for maybe decision making or these kind of democratic institutional things. And maybe the part of the fun, of course, of Twitter and other social media is the ruckus, it is the mayhem, it is all these things we are also drawn to as humans. And I think that's that's what's also nice about the nightclub or the street or other, let's say, more traditional public spaces. So I think that could be a very important thing to cherish and cultivate, and should be part of, let's say, our definition of what the internet as a public sphere should be. It should also be a creative, adventurous place for experimentation and...
Obviously, I mean, I'm also not blind for human nature, so I agree with what you say. On the other hand, there's also a lot of good that people want to do. And I also feel that if you want to design a public sphere, it should cater to those instincts or to those intuitions and to those things. And it should perhaps entertain, maybe even from a therapeutic point of perspective, the lower emotions or the lesser intuitions, but it shouldn't like cater to it like those spectacle algorithms do these days. Just to keep people's attention, you're just forced into this even lower and lower spiral.
True. I'm curious from our audience, does anyone use Twitter? Not on Twitter?
Yeah, one Twitter.
One Twitter. Do you recognize what Ben is saying, or we're kind of acknowledging that actually the unhealthier aspects of are what make it fun?
I don't know.
Oh, there's a mic for you.
Yeah, hi. There's probably part of that, but I think it's also one of the reasons why I'm not that active on Twitter anymore. And I shifted more of my attention actually to LinkedIn, because that's where sort of more are the conversations happening that I find interesting, where people really talk about the work, the discussions that they have, etc.
Right. Maybe you're just a very healthy person.
Yeah, I guess. Sorry about that. Yeah, boring.
No, not at all. Yeah. All right.
No, but I think the point from Chris is important. I think though that, I mean, if you look at let's say the algorithms that run the feed, yeah, they're engagement-based algorithms, and I think one of the interesting things or futures we could imagine for social media is that, and yeah, there's like voices for this, and also Ben points to it in his book as well. You can have a more federated or decentralized social media landscape, maybe where a protocol is central instead of the walled garden of a platform. And so parallel to, I mean, Mastodon is one example. It runs on ActivityPub. So that's basically a protocol where multiple social media and services, so it's a very decentralized way to do it. Also parallel to Twitter, Jack Dorsey, the former CEO, started a project called Blue Sky, which is also actually trying to move away from platform to protocol. So they're also developing in an open protocol. And one of the ideas, at least, I mean, we don't know what it looks like yet because it's not really out there running anything. But one of the ideas is algorithmic freedom. Is that so you could choose like what your view in the world is, because the feed is basically a kind of view you get, a lens you get on the world. And one alternative algorithm, at least we came across last week, was bridge-based ranking. So, and that's been developed, and it kind of looks at something. Also, engagement-based ranking looks at, yeah, okay, what evokes the most emotions and extreme emotions, and that gets promoted. Yeah, here there's like a slide which kind of illustrates. So the left, so these are kind of mini feeds, let's say. So the left one is the engagement-based ranking, and the right one is bridge-based ranking. So let's say this in this simplified society, you have two parties, green and blue, two ends of the political spectrum. And let's say in the engagement one, let's say the extremer emotions, and especially on each side, are promoted. So for instance, here post C is promoted in engagement, but it's the lowest one in the bridging algorithm. And there A is actually, so where both opposite, or A, where opposite sides of the post kind of agree. Well, it's kind of, but at least it shows it doesn't have to be this way. You can make any kind of algorithm which kind of promotes different kinds of social interaction and different kinds of what the world could look like.
Is this clear to everyone? Almost, not a little bit. It's starting to land.
Well, maybe
yeah.
To explain it a bit further, it's so it kind of, they made a kind of machine learning algorithm, as far as I understand. I can properly explain it here, but that kind of analyzes all the users, kind of clusters them into kind of ideological similar, let's say, camps.
Mm-hmm.
Then they see how people respond to certain content, and then they see, oh, if like people from different camps on this spectrum actually find agreement or go into useful, like kind of civil discussion, let's say, then it's promoted. So it bridges all these different parts of the spectrum and looks for kind of common denominators.
Yeah.
And that is the stuff that's promoted.
Instead of polarization that causes a lot of engagement, but actually doesn't help build bridges.
Exactly. So let's say for looking for consensus, this would be an algorithm that could help finding it in a very, let's say, large community of users.
Yeah, so common denominator makes something rise up in the algorithm.
Yeah.
Okay. And what's your question around that? Or
I don't know where we start.
No, maybe Ben, I'm curious what you think, because this bridging algorithm was developed in Taiwan, where they have a much more public awareness, let's say, as opposed to, and I don't know if you correct me if I'm wrong, to the United States, which is more market-oriented, perhaps. So they, from a policy point of perspective, they don't approach it as much as a market, but as a, maybe a more Habermasian public domain. But that...
What's this Habermas thing you both...
Well, Habermas was a philosopher, and he researched saloons in the 18th century, and he came up with the idea of a public domain, an accessible, equal place where, like Elon Musk Town Square, where people from all walks of life could join, and where public opinion was formed, where community was produced, etc. And that's also one of the inspirations for our speculative research. But I think, I mean, I don't know if, correct me if I'm wrong, but like European regulators, they approach the whole internet thing as a market because they sort of forgotten after 40 years of neoliberalism that they can also approach it as a public good, as a commons, or as a public infrastructure like water or anything else. How do you feel about that, Ben?
It's interesting trying to think of like what the better metaphor for a better internet would be, because we're on the same page about, you know, the market is certainly the dominant metaphor, and I think has been a quite destructive one. But then what's the better one? You know, and one hears a lot of different terms: public sphere, public good, commons. I've actually been drawn more to ecological metaphors, and one that I like in particular is the forest. And what I like about it is the heterogeneity of it. And I think this connects to something we were talking about before, which is that the internet doesn't have to be as monolithic as it is today. It's in fact monolithic because so much of our online life is organized by a handful of these immense
Do
platforms.
we understand the word monolithic? Yeah? Okay. All right.
And Ethan Zuckerman has a great gloss on this, which is, you know, when you think about how our cities are organized, you have different spaces for different types of activities. You have the nightclub, you have the church, you have the assembly hall. You wouldn't go into a nightclub in order to have a reasonable conversation with your neighbor about how the municipality should do garbage collection. That's not the right setting for that interaction, right? But what we have are platforms that, you know, because of the commercial incentives that we've been discussing, organize those types of conversations as a nightclub, as a casino. And it's not appropriate. And it produces these kind of perversions of discourse. So I think we need to think about the internet as a space where we can have different types of human pursuits, because, you know, there are many different kinds of human beings, and there are many different types of things we like to do as human beings. And but critically, you know, different spaces, different structures can be designed, you know, the digital architecture of them for different purposes. And it's important to know where to have, you know, the interaction that you're looking to have. I think we can, so in any case, the forest for me, which might be pretentious, is a way to articulate some of that diversity.
What kind of design principles or thoughts come from that analogy, do you feel? What should happen to make that happen?
To make the digital realm more like a forest.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I confess that I'm not a designer, so I couldn't, and I think you all are the experts on this matter.
Oh yeah, no, more like, yeah, so we sort of speculated on a, sort of universal data commons, a sort of place where the network effect is, and which generates data ownership, it produces community, it organizes verified truths, etc. as a sort of a base layer, public base layer, democratic public base layer on which perhaps this forest could grow. I don't know if that will happen, but it's sort of a speculative design.
Maybe if you
probe.
ask the question without the words design principles, and we can just ask,
Yeah.
how can the internet
what would
become
you, as
more
a
like
tech
a forest?
worker, yeah, how would the internet work as a forest?
Yeah.
Well, this is, I hope not too avoidant an answer, but I think we need to find ways to enlist the creativity of the people who use the internet themselves, and to some extent break down the boundary between creator and user of technology. You know, those of us who work in the industry, those of you who work as designers and so on, you know, we inhabit these kind of highly specialized roles. And I'm very interested in traditions like participatory design, co-design, design justice that experiment with ways of devolving some of those decisions onto the communities who will be affected by them. In the book, I talk a bit about some of these experiments in kind of collective imagination. And this is not imagination as kind of solitary genius sitting in their room and coming up with some brilliant new blueprint, but people working together in settings that have access to material resources. Imagination is expensive, as we all know, and figuring out what some of these spaces look like themselves. And again, kind of without sounding too hopelessly utopian, kind of giving space to all the different genres of human. I mean, there's something to my mind about the contemporary internet that feels, you know, so much like a shopping mall, as I talk about in the book. And so the idea here is, well, you know, what if we found a way to break down the walls of those enclosures and kind of seed them with invasive species and turn the kind of shopping mall into this this kind of wild profusion of kind of different clusters of different types of online pursuit.
I love that, different genres of humans. I would love to ask if anyone has a question already. Yeah, I think you do, yeah.
I just had a thought because your question about... thank you. I was already starting to be very loud. Hello. Hi. Thank you for being here. Your first question on what is the function of the internet if you compare it to a public space, which is designed with the idea that it has a function for us. And then now the answer, I was thinking that maybe internet is a place where we can create it. So instead of just a marketplace or like a physical place, it's already designed. But the internet is like, it is made while we are using it. So yeah, I just wanted to say that for me it's interesting not to see it as me as a consumer, but actually as a producer. But I've never actually, I'm a bit younger, but I've never experienced the internet as something that I am co-creating. And for me, it really changes also that I'm not consumed by it, but I have agency, like I'm co-creating it.
You're co-creating it, you're making it, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a super important one, and it's also, I think, yeah, I'm a bit older generation, and also a bit like Ben. I mean, yeah, I remember the early internet. I made my first website, so I know the producer part of it. I mean, not like any expert way, but tinkering with it, fiddling with it, but like feeling confident enough, like that. Oh yeah, a website. I can make it from scratch on a server. I can just put an HTML file, and I'll have a website. And that's, I mean, if you grow up just with this kind of consumer internet, this part of the imagination, yeah, it's almost alien. It's like, oh, is this a way? And it's almost more, not let's say like a finished city with a public space, but it's more like a new settlement where we have to, in a way, kind of make the new rules. So, yeah, this new rule like maybe a universal data commons, or, okay, how are we going to connect everything? How do we make it interoperable? How do I know who you are? Do you have to have, you know, a membership card at every bar, at every saloon? Or do you have one passport and you can show everywhere what age you are to, well, etc.
Do you don't think that it's also more people of your generation, let's say, or age, like the generations that saw the internet come into being, that will drive the change because they're not used to being a consumer only?
Well, in a way, I think in that sense, this is also an interesting moment. So the techlash happened. Like a lot of people are being fired right now at the big social media companies. So of course, Musk is doing crazy things, but also at Facebook, a lot of people left. And there's this economic downturn, and there's this new legislation. So the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act from the EU is coming. There's the Access Act in the works in the US, but I know very little about it. But so there's momentum, let's say doing kind of regulating and breaking up the market work. And also interoperability is kind of becoming enforced. So there is a kind of playing field opening up where these kind of more decentralized and new initiatives, and I think it comes from both ends. So, and the people who have the skills to do things, but I think also public institutions, governments, or libraries, I love that example from your book, could take a role to also build parts, like for instance, just this simple thing of your user ID, that you have to make a new one on every website you go. I mean, this should be a kind of public service, you know. The Universal Data Commons could be an ID, and it could be enforced that, you have one, it's a kind of a self-sovereign identity thing, you have a lot of control over it, and it's kind of secured by a kind of public commons or infrastructure. Yeah, so it should there should be a public common part of it. There should be lots of new, let's say, initiatives from private parties, companies, whatever. And I think they're somewhere in between this kind of new town.
Yeah. Were there any other questions? Oh, yeah, two even. And also maybe to remind people watching online, you can also ask your questions by going to menti.com and then typing in 45786736. What's your question?
Yeah.
And maybe your name.
I'm Nick, and I was wondering where you would put Wikipedia and more broadly Wikimedia and Wikicommons in this discussion about making the internet more for all and also more like a common place, because that's I think ideally what it is. I doubt it is actually as ideal as they say it is to be, but I feel that Wikipedia at least is also a place where people come together, actively create new pieces of internet, share knowledge. And yeah, for some reason I kept reading the book and I was like, when is he going to mention Wikipedia? When is he going to mention Wikipedia? And it didn't come. So that was, I think, I find it surprising, and I was wondering why, basically, but also is it not? Yeah, why is it? Why wouldn't it be a good example as to how we could do the internet?
Right. Good question. Ben, do you want to take that up?
This actually came up in some of the reviews of the book, because Wikipedia, I think, is often pointed to as a kind of possible model. I think that Wikipedia, when one looks at kind of the internal struggles over how topics are written, and also in the kind of demographic composition of who actually contributes to Wikipedia, there are elements that I find kind of less than utopian, and that may be, you know, the same could be said of projects like Mastodon, of course, which I do discuss in the book. But I felt that my feeling about Wikipedia has always been that, in addition to the kind of unsavory aspects of some of the behind the scenes debates that occur among the site's contributors, I've also felt, perhaps incorrectly, that the lessons of Wikipedia are not particularly portable, that people have been kind of thinking about for a while kind of how to construct online commons on the kind of wiki model, you know, because this has been an area of great interest for as long as Wikipedia has been around, which is for a while. And I don't know that there have been many successful results. So to my mind, Wikipedia is a very interesting kind of freak accident almost, which I rely on for my own purposes, but I didn't know how to integrate it as a lesson, basically, for other models.
Great question, great answer. Thank you. Let's go to our next question. Or was it satisfactory for you? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, thanks. My name is Martijn de Waal. Yeah, no, thanks for this great discussion. And Ben, I'd like to challenge you a bit on the metaphor of the forest. Because on the one hand, I like it. I mean, it has all these associations of symbioses and, you know, this diversity of species that are there. But on the other hand, the forest, at least the forest that comes into my mind, but maybe you have a different one, it doesn't have any governance or institutions, right? And there is also no justice in a forest. I mean, the forest itself doesn't really care which species survives or which species doesn't, or who eats who, etc., etc. So, I mean, where would that part come in? And actually, when I was also a bit amazed when you said the forest is a great metaphor, but then you actually described the city. So is maybe the city not a better metaphor?
How did you describe the city?
As this place of diversity where you have different sites which all have their different how sort of situated expected behaviors, their different ways of governing them, etc., which is diversity. But at the same time, there is, at least in Western democratic countries, there are institutions that also govern the city as a whole. The city also has some spaces that are sort of left open, which are maybe squats or sort of empty lands where sort of stuff happens that is not institutionalized in any way. So for me, this would be a much more interesting metaphor to approach the internet.
Interesting. I would love to hear your responses. Well, I guess Ben, first of all, and you as well. Unless Christian wants to go first.
No, I think the question was...
Please.
Well, I think the question was directed to Ben, but
yeah, it was. But you seem so ready to answer it. Okay, maybe we can let Ben answer first. See what he has to say about this.
It's a good question. I think, to my mind, there is no kind of forest that is really untouched by human activity anymore. So the kind of forest I had in mind was actually something in the United States called a national forest, which is a particular kind of federally recognized entity in which different types of activity can coexist. So you can have certain types of economic activity, extractive activity in a national forest. It can also be used for recreation, for camping and things like that. So, I think I agree with you. It's important to have a metaphor that incorporates and reflects some kind of governance mechanism. But I think in my own work, I've also shied away from placing too much emphasis on governance from above and presenting too much of a kind of public policy approach. Obviously, there is an important role to be played by public policy, but I think my own kind of anarchistic leanings have also wanted me to place great emphasis on the primacy of bottom-up experimentation, and maybe governance, to my mind, sounds a bit bureaucratic as a term, although I recognize also that it's a necessary component of the whole.
Yeah, I was thinking, because your book is also called The Internet for the People, so there is something like the people. Like there are a bunch of individuals who consider themselves a community, and I do have the feeling like if you use the metaphor of a forest, I think Martijn has a point that there is no self. Maybe a forest is self-aware, and it discusses all kinds of values that will govern the forest itself, but I'm not aware of it. And I think if you want to create the people, then you should have a mechanism that aligns values, that aligns norms, that aligns standards, that creates a sort of togetherness that itself produces trust. And I think it's inescapable that that it needs some kind of design. It needs some, especially in a super complex society as ours, it needs certain institutions, and with that I don't refer to the bureaucratic ones that we have these days or we inherited, but we need some kind of social institutions that produce trust. And I think the internet should be designed in a light-hearted way, but it should be designed in such a way that it produces, that it brings people together so that these people can produce and align values and trust, etc. And
I wonder.
yeah.
I'm curious if Ben actually agrees that for internet for the people to work, that you need shared values and norms and forming like a shared group called the people.
Yeah, sort of a base layer of values. I mean, obviously you have all kinds of subcultures and you need all kinds of diversity, but you need all agree that murdering each other at first sight is not a good idea. You need some kind of cultural base layer.
I mean, the construction of the people is always this complex political project. Who gets to be in the people, and who are you really speaking to? Virtually all politicians in kind of liberal democracies invoke the people, but inevitably they are trying to activate kind of portions of the people against other portions. There's always these implicit or explicit divisions within the people, and the question is always, well, which divisions do you care about? Are you dividing the people on the basis of racial and ethnic lines, as many reactionary politicians do? Are you attempting to produce a polarization along class lines, which is, my preferred approach? So in a sense, the people is, there is always going to have to be a division that you are kind of attempting to overcome. And I think this is obviously somewhat out of scope of the book itself, but I suppose that would be my one kind of divergence from some of what we've been discussing, which is that there are political enemies in my analysis, and those are people who whose power has to be, we have to deprive them of power, and that's part of the politics of building a better internet and building a better society.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. But my point was more like, I think the internet a healthy internet or a healthy public domain in our lingo can play a really big role in producing a community and countering perhaps political adventurism and political, if it's, I think, yeah. So I think you're completely right in saying that the people is something that can be manipulated, distorted, played out against each other. It can be looked this way or that way, and it's a very diverse thing and a very dynamic thing. But still, there needs to be a sort of common thing, a common language, for instance, which is handy to create a common people.
Are there any more or other avenues that you three would, and all of us would like to explore together in terms of, like this future ideal of a digital public sphere, and or the conditions for that, or like, like aspects that we have really not covered, or like that nobody is thinking about?
Well, I'm just curious. Yeah, so Ben, you've talked a lot about the book at different occasions, and now here tonight with us. I'm also curious, like, what have you learned, like, discussing it, and is it like also informing kind of new avenues for you where you want to go with your research or with your thinking?
Yeah, I think the book is really about the political economy of the internet, and making the case that, how the internet has been owned over the years, in particular the transition from public to private control and the different forms of private control that have developed over the course of its deeper and deeper commercialization are the most important things to understand if we want to understand what the internet is. I think I still believe that, but I guess I'm more and more interested in the micro scale, in, you know, the kind of you need Marx and Freud, if you like. And I think that's informed more of my current thinking about the internet.
What do you mean by that, Ben? You need Marx and Freud?
That you need Marx to understand, well, you don't need it. I need Marx personally to understand the kind of macro
Sometimes
scale
I do.
of the political economy, of the internet, of all spheres of human life, that the kind of basic insight of historical materialism, that the ways in which we produce and reproduce the conditions of our lives is often, although not always, the most important element in how our societies are organized. I still believe that, and I think that kind of basic insight has guided a lot of my thinking, but that only takes you so far. And I think it's particularly useful at a macro scale. But once we descend into the world of individuals, it helps to acquire other analytical tools. I'm certainly not the first in history to suggest that maybe Marx could be synthesized with Freud. I'm obviously following in the footsteps of many others. But you know, whether it's Freud or someone else, trying to understand, for instance, to return to an earlier part of our conversation, why people behave the way they do on Twitter. You know, what are the various kind of psychic impulses and drives that are being indulged and released through some of the very bizarre things we see on social media. I wouldn't ascribe too much explanatory power to that, because it's only one piece of it. But increasingly, that's kind of where my brain is more interested in going.
I mean, that's interesting. Like one of the, let's say, frameworks we use to kind of look at, let's say, our trust crisis at the moment is like this very long-term view that we've moved from an information culture based on the spoken word, from, let's say, medieval times, towards early modernity and modernity proper, as a kind of the emergence of a literate culture and literate man, so to speak. And that now, yeah, with the emergence of the digital information culture, a kind of new, yeah, and this information culture is not just infrastructure, cables, and platforms. It's also us. It's like, I mean, how the book and literacy has transformed how we think, how we act. Yeah. So do you have kind of first, let's say, ideas? What do you think? What this means, kind of for evolution, a kind of evolution from being a literate modern human being towards what a digital human being? What kind of change in psychology this could be?
Yeah, it's such a difficult question, because you know, these cultural forms, they don't displace one another. They kind of layer on top of each other like sediment, right? You know, we're still reading, or hopefully some of us are still reading books. I guess maybe fewer. But you know, books persist as a technology, you know, for several centuries and remain extremely important in scholarly contexts. We're still watching television. We're still watching a lot of television, you know, more than they were in the 60s, which is supposed to be the age of television. So I think that I'm not a scholar of this by any means. My wife is. We should ask her what she thinks. But to my mind, it's hard to get my head around. Is she home? She might be upstairs, actually. We could bring the whole family on the call. Get the girls involved, my insane children. It's hard for me to wrap my head around this subject, because you know, all these kind of technologies kind of overlap and you know, interpenetrate with one another. And even in the case of our kind of informational ecosystems, I talk about this in the book a bit, but you know, one of the most popular Facebook accounts is Fox News. You know, just to give you an example of kind of how these different kind of pieces of our media ecosystems are deeply entangled with one another. There aren't very clear boundaries. So this is just adding more complication and saying that I don't know the answer to your question, but it's something I struggle with, is you know, how we're certainly different types of humans than we were 500 years ago, but we would actually have, you know, things to talk about if Gutenberg kind of arose from the grave. He would recognize at least a few of the things that we do with our media.
And maybe on that psychology point, what I'm kind of keep hearing between the lines, or maybe that's just my interpretation. But you know, like at the beginning of the conversation, Ben, you also said that we, as kind of not always healthy animals, also use the internet for our escapism, for, right? Maybe like escape from the stress and the issues in the offline world. And is it what you are saying is that, do you want to flip that around and use the internet rather to make the offline world better? So we're maybe less stressed out and we need to escape less, become more healthy as a whole?
Yeah. Well, I think if we can, let's say, escape the grasp of the engagement machine, that would be healthy for everybody. I think everybody recognizes this kind of toxic relationship you have with your social media accounts. And I think, well, yeah, there's a healthier relationship possible there. But of course, we're out of control there. And the only thing somehow is to cancel it, so the wholesale to go away.
Yeah. But what I'm hearing you say is also to use the online as a means to make the offline better, right? Or to make it better.
Yeah.
Well, I also have the feeling that with the introduction of a new information technology, there's also becoming a new awareness that the other information technologies, the spoken word, the printed word, are also still very important and should not be forgotten. There's now this new debate going on in we work a lot in education, and in the educational realm, what should be done with phones in the classroom. I mean, with the attention economy in the classroom, et cetera, and there should be more emphasis on reading, but they also recognize there should also be more emphasis on rhetorics. Because now they recognize, hey, there are multiple ways of expression, of ordering information, of transferring
and more
information.
Emphasis on coding. So, like your producer, can you not just relate to it as consumer? So, it's like the code, spoken word, rhetorics, literacy, proper deep reading skills.
And they're still searching for it. They don't have the answer, but at least there is an awareness from, hey, we've forgotten how to properly teach children to speak, to do rhetorics, to make an argument. And now there's a new information technology. Hey, they need really good writing skills, and they also need really good speaking skills.
For
and
all the layers of sediment.
Yeah, so there's more complexity added. So now they're also thinking, oh, maybe high school should be 5 years longer.
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera. At least the debate is.
You're like, no.
No. No, but I think the other thing it needs to do, to come back to your question, is that.
I'm curious though why you're saying like no.
I just think we should not think that the digital age or something is really so important that the whole society has to change. I think it's really wrong, actually. I think we are still we are not so intelligent. We cannot deal with it. I think we need a lot of laws actually that stop companies to create social media like they are. I think we cannot deal with it, and we should not change, because I think we cannot teach kids to deal with the existence of Instagram right now. We should not give longer school. We should change how we relate to it. I think
we should just stay human.
Yeah. We have no choice. Otherwise, we will go crazy.
Yeah,
but I think that taps into so somehow, we need to, as Chris said, so society with this new information technology is getting more complex. So we had this kind of bureaucratic machinery of our, let's say, 19th and 20th century modern, let's say, states and institutions, etc. Now there's this digital layer coming on top of that.
Yeah.
And there's many more information flowing through this realm. So the information is just getting more and more complex. But we as humans, it's kind of impossible to properly relate to that. So we somehow need something that makes it simpler and smarter. And this is a very messy transition, because basically all our big institutions are still bureaucracies. All these kind of new developments are let's say, Wild West, mostly commercialized now. And this will take a while before you have, let's say, a state that's properly, let's say, digital, maybe in 100 years or so. But that's basically should make stuff easier, more accessible, and that I spend less time in feeds and doing stupid stuff on my phone. But that kind of makes more space for being human, doing things that we value as human beings.
Yeah. We, if you would see our clock behind you, we're kind of slowly coming to the end of our evening together. Unless there's some super burning questions still left. Yeah.
Sorry. So we have... So how much time do we have? Should I be really fast?
-5.
Ask your questions. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's just answer your question.
I had one more thought about the forest. Also, it's not created by humans. It's nature, and I think it's really different. The way nature and animals create a place and the way humans create a place. And it causes very different problems. So for me also, a city is maybe more... I'm actually really not technological. I'm anthropologist, so... But for me, a city is really tempting as a metaphor, because a forest, you know, trees and their roots, and the roots communicate. It's really...
Maybe it's a strange mix of the both.
Of or that, yeah.
Because like all the AI and the black boxes of how
they have their own
works is kind of like a weird rhizomatic root
network
system where we don't really know what's happening.
That's true, yeah.
Maybe that's a good place to end.
There's trees
I'm
in
sorry.
the city.
Oh, actually, I was still... sorry. My last question is, do you think there should be legislation for social media companies that cause addiction? Maybe there could be legislation for this, because for me, it's so unhealthy and it's really doing something bad to people. So you can maybe see it like this, like that just this addiction is forbidden.
Ben, well, how would you reflect on that question?
It's a tough one, because I think there are very clearly documented ways in which social media can contribute to depression, eating disorders, that's come up in the United States a lot, anxiety, and so on. On the other hand, I'm always reluctant to pathologize online behaviors. I think the rhetoric of public health can become very disciplinary and can kind of create policing mechanisms that can actually endanger people who are using the internet in ways that are basically safe and for their own sanity. You know, just to give a random example, often autistic kids find it easier to interact with the screen. And sometimes that behavior is kind of pathologized as, you know, too much screen time. And it may just be for them a matter of survival. I know that's not what you're referring to in your question, but I think that's some of the danger I see in some of the public health rhetoric that can be applied to internet policy. But, you know, I think that there's another just very old-fashioned answer here, which is that we are experiencing, at least in the United States, a very severe mental health crisis. People are committing suicide, they're overdosing on drugs, they're engaging in all sorts of antisocial and violent behaviors. And, you know, what we need at the end of the day, I think, is less a set of rules telling Instagram what they can and can't do, but a massive investment in our ability to care for people. You know, people are really breaking down online and off, and they need services.
Can I react?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, agree. But what about companies that are really made to make people addicted? I think there's really a responsibility, and it's the same with alcohol. Is forbidden for a certain age. That's for a reason, right? And isn't it the same? So I don't mean screen time. I don't mean internet in general. I mean specifically
law,
Instagram or Facebook. So specifically platforms that are really, really intentionally 100% made to make people addicted, to put this thing in the brain that you keep scrolling. So I mean really this, like, it's not about policing, or it is, but...
What would Marx say about this?
I understand the question, I think, better now, which is you're speaking more specifically about the way in which these platforms are designed to
and whether there
keep
should
people
be
on the site.
policy or legislation or law that just forbids that, basically.
Certainly. So there's all sorts of public policy interventions that have been contemplated about, how these filtering algorithms are allowed to work. And you could imagine, we've been discussing in this conversation, giving people options of different filtering algorithms. Also, alternatively, saying, there are certain things you're allowed to optimize for. There are certain things you're not allowed to optimize for. I mean, I think, again, to your question about Marx, I mean, at root, this is about the fact that these are profit maximizing enterprises, and the way in which they make their money is by manufacturing and monetizing as much data about you as possible. So the business model, I think itself is deeply rotten. I think we can soften some of the damage that the business model inflicts through certain types of regulations, but I think I'm more interested in what we've mostly been talking about here, which is developing entirely new types of services that don't have those same incentive structures.
Great. Thank you for that, Ben. And with that, I would actually like to go to you both, Edwin and Chris, because this is really the end of our 4-episode series, and your fellowship about architectures of trust. So, from this wonderful conversation, and maybe also from what stands out to you from the ones we had before, what would you say you will take along with you in your work as futurists? That's maybe also just interesting for all of us to hear. Like, what really stood out and kind of made you like, whoa, yeah.
Well, I think most of it needs to sink in. But I think what I really found inspiring from reading Ben's book, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but that's what I recognize, is that so we need a social movement to address these issues, but a successful social movement also needs a new language to think about it, to think about the issues, to frame it, and it needs a design toolkit to engage with it. And I think that in all these conversations we had with all these people, we're sort of searching for this new language, these new words. And Ben goes back to Marx for inspiration. And he correctly assumed we went to Habermas for inspiration for a public domain. And I think now we're looking back in order to find the words in which to address this situation. And I think at one point we can look forward and create new words and new think frames and new toolkits. And I think that would be a starting point of which we can really address many issues that govern our society today, or misgovern our society today.
Thanks. Do you want to briefly add anything?
No, I concur. This is a good
wrap up. Yeah. And is there maybe any call to action based on everything that we've discussed for the audience, for people watching? What would you like us to take away?
Well, I think, be curious and adventurous, because there are already a lot of interesting other initiatives on the web. So there's other stuff than Twitter and Facebook. So I know, so you can be in a way like an early adopter, but in the social movement kind of way. So you can, let's say, okay, what are other tools? What are other ways? And the internet is still a very rich place. If you care to look outside of the dominant players, there's a lot of interesting things out there. But yeah, you'll have to search a little bit longer, dive a little bit deeper. But there's a lot of people, especially I think a lot of people who have worked in tech in one way or another and kind of understand what's going on and are, let's say, have the skills to develop alternatives. they are doing it.
Yeah.
So there is a culture there. And so a lot of these ideas that we've also used in our future scenarios, it's not that we've like completely made them up. This is like assembled from a lot of thinking that's been out there.
Of course, yeah.
Some of it we made up.
Some of it we made up.
That's your job.
but a lot of let's say the technical parts of it, smart people are working on it.
Yeah.
And if you're curious, you can find it and you can start playing with it.
Great. Thank you for that wrap up, and thank you so much, Ben Tarnoff, for gracing us with your presence here today. It was really valuable.
Thanks so much.
To have the conversation with you. Say hi to your wife and your girls from us.
I will. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ben.
All right. So thank you all for your active participation as well in the conversation and thinking together. This concludes our fellowship with the Chrononauts.
Yay.
Yeah, and of course, like the insights will sink in and reverberate and come back in different shapes and forms in your work, I'm sure. But thank you for exploring this whole idea of new architectures of trust and the digital world with us, taking us along your thinking and your speculation. We really appreciate it. Yeah. Designing Cities for All is not over, of course. We'll be back on Monday, December the 12th at 8. With a wrap-up of 2 years of the Designing Cities for All program, in which we've learned about so many aspects of inclusive design. And great news that is very recent and fresh is that DCFA Designing Cities for All will actually continue for another 2 years, in which inclusive design will be taken on again, but through a new, fresh lens. And if you want to know what that lens is, then you're super welcome to come to Pakhuis on Monday, December the 12th, or tune in online for free on dezwijger.nl. And on this night, we'll also present 2 different Designing Cities for All publications, which is the essay book, the DCFA essay book, More Perspectives on Designing Cities for All. You see it here behind me. And also the DCFA Design Principles, a booklet with all kinds of insights, tools, and tips which can be used by everyone who wants to truly design for all. So don't miss out. Sign up for the celebration at dezwijger.nl. You can also become a friend of Pakhuis de Zwijger because, of course, these programs are always free and accessible for everyone. But if you want to support, you can scan the QR code that you'll see in a bit and become a friend and think along. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being here. And to watch back old episodes, you can go to dezwijger.nl/DCFA. Have a great evening for now.